Um, so I know most of you, but just as we're recording this, other people, my name is Brian Flanagan. I am happily the coordinator for adult faith formation here at Holy Trinity Parish. And we're here tonight to talk about baptism as part of our series on baptism in this Easter season. And with us is our parishioner, but so much more than a parishioner, Dr. John Borelli. So I'll introduce John in a moment. I'm going to begin with a prayer, and it's a prayer for our new Pope. Um, it's a prayer that I found on the website for CAFOD, the British agency that does charity from the Catholic churches in the United Kingdom. So let's get present wherever we are, in our rooms, in our offices. God is always present with us. Our mistake is sometimes not paying attention. So wherever you need to be present first. Faithful God, you guide us in the path of life, and your goodness is our constant companion. Be with our new shepherd, Pope Leo XIV, in his service to the Church. Fill him with the power of your Spirit, the peace of your presence, and the compassion of Christ. May he walk with you in wisdom and humility, and lead us, together with all God's people, to embody your love for the world. Amen.
Amen.
And so our main speaker tonight is known to many of us already in the parish, but if you don't know him, Dr. John Borelli. John has served in a number of roles as a theologian, as a teacher, as a professor, as the associate director for the Secretariat for Ecumenical and Religious Affairs at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And today at Georgetown as the senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and as special assistant to the president's office for Catholic Identity and Dialogue. So we're really grateful to have John with us tonight to be sharing some of his wisdom with us and with the parish. John, we're talking tonight about our shared baptism, about synodality and ecumenism, the relations between different Christian churches. And so I wanted to start, before we even get to some of your prepared remarks, tell us a little bit about your involvement in ecumenism. What got you going in this? What made you start your research and your thought and your speaking in this direction? How did you end up doing this work?
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. Well, I grew up in Oklahoma, which was 2% Catholic. And at the time, a lot of all my neighborhood friends were not Catholics. And we were very much aware, and they were very much aware I was a Catholic. And so from time to time, we had to discuss matters. But when I was in high school and college, 2 years high school, first 2 years of college, while Vatican II met, and my parish was very attuned liturgically to what was coming. We were really quite liturgically astute, and we had a music director already before 1960 who was composing music for the liturgy and so forth. So Vatican II for me had a lot to do with liturgy, and I was picking up about lay leadership. I was in a minor seminary in Oklahoma, and it just became clear to me that I could be a theologian and I didn't have to be ordained. I could do so as a layperson. And I finished college at St. Louis University and went on to graduate school thinking I would be a theologian, working the new theology, historical theology. And eventually, though I found my way for a variety of reasons into history of religions, because I felt there was a greater need for opening up interreligious dialogue. And that's what I thought I was going to do. And after my doctorate, while I was teaching in New York, I was invited on the Ecumenical Commission of the Archdiocese. And I said, well, I'll come on board, but I really want to do interreligious dialogue. And they said, oh, sure. We'll get to that. And I said, well, don't you have theologians at the seminary here in New York at Dunwoody who do ecumenism? Well, they kind of smiled. We want young lay theologians on board. So nobody was doing it at the seminary. And so found myself going to ecumenical dialogues in New York. I went to an institute, and eventually the Archdiocese hired me on a part-time basis while I was teaching full-time to write in ecumenism. I was formed by the people who were at the council who worked on the documents, a number of them, and they've all passed away. And so when I write on Nostra Aetate, they got to take my word for it for what they told me, because they can't contradict me now. But I learned a great deal. And before you knew it, the opportunity came for me to be the first one to do interreligious relations at the Bishops' Conference. And so Marianne and I moved our family down from New York after 17 years of life there in 1987. And the director said, interreligious is new, and they wanted me mainly to get Christian, Catholic, Muslim dialogues going, which I had been successful in doing in New York. But you better do some ecumenism so the bishops get to know you. So I've always had a hand in ecumenical relations, and it's become more and more important for me over the years. And I always include that in what I do along with my interreligious work. So that's more or less it.
Yeah.
And ecumenists never fade away. We just die. We just stay committed to ecumenism. Unlike old soldiers, we are the opposite. We just keep going because of the commitment to it. I think Walt is an ecumenist too. He can't get rid of the bug. He's part of this group here. So
Yeah. Well, so we're pairing tonight talking about baptism and ecumenism with synodality.
yes,
So tell us a little bit about some of your thoughts on synodality, why it's important, what baptism has to do with all of that.
sure. And I'm sure everybody here wants to talk about Pope Leo, right?
We'll
So we're
get
going
there.
to get to
Yeah,
that at the
go there right
end,
now. Yeah.
and where he fits this, because he will. I am hopeful he will. But the Synod was really good for ecumenism, and I know a couple of people. I know several people who were there, but one fellow ecumenist, a theologian, was there, Catherine Clifford, and she was part of both sessions, and she had very good things to say about what was going on. And I was delighted she was there. I lived vicariously through her. But I actually talked to Bishop Brian Farrell. He's the brother of Kevin Farrell. Brian Farrell has been slugging away in the Vatican for 25, 27 years in ecumenism. And his brother gets made a cardinal and brought to Rome, after a few years to run a dicastery. But Brian is the one who's been the secretary for now the dicastery for promoting Christian unity. And he really had, the secretary is the one who moves things along more so than the prefect. Actually, the Synod was good on ecumenism. Perhaps the fact that Pope Francis has accepted the final document of the Synod on synodality and declined to write an apostolic exhortation is a sign of his own understanding of a new balance between primacy and synodality. In the past, the Synod of Bishops was created at the end of Vatican II to keep synodality going. But in point of fact, it was a curia controlled event, so much so that bishops dreaded going because they often had little influence on the outcome. And the principles were prepared by everyone, but the text was being written in the back room, and the Pope put out an exhortation that became the final document of the Synod. In fact, Bergoglio, when he was in Buenos Aires, was reluctant to go to the last synod that he was invited to, because he said, what point? I make a 10-minute intervention, the red light goes on, and I'm supposed to stop speaking, and that's it. I mean, to what end? So he wanted to change synodality, and he changed it by the method, meeting twice, by bringing lay people and clergy in with the bishops to deliberate, and not and to accept the final document as the final document of the Synod. What seems very significant to me, according to Brian Farrell, is that the Synod's final document calls for mutual accountability among the churches for who we are, what we do, and what we teach. Catholic involvement in the search for Christian unity may have taken a leap forward. So I think it'll play out in that, on the one hand, the Pope as a servant to the unity of the church, and that's his role, and he's asked for ecumenical comments on that. and that's been going on for decades now, since 1995, may begin to convene a synod of all the churches, those that are willing to come and to deliberate on common issues, like understanding baptism among ourselves. I think we pretty much have consensus on that. So maybe a more significant issue for our current times. So
Yeah.
I'm hopeful that we have correct, when Vatican II ended, I thought we were going to have synodality all across the place. In parishes, parish councils would be effective. My father was elected to the first one in our home parish and was president of it. But it didn't always work out, did it? And in a lot of places, parish councils aren't working. In other places in the world, it did work out. And Francis wanted to restore what we expected 60 years ago to have taken place. Consultation. When I was in New York working with the Archdiocese, I got a letter from the chairman, the Monsignor chairman of the commission, asking, are there any archdiocesan priests you think are worthy to be promoted as bishop? That was one time. That was 81, 82. Has anyone here gotten a letter recommending to recommend to the bishop or archbishop clergy for? So I'm hoping that it's here to stay, and it's going to have it's an important ecumenical dimension to have synodality in the right
Yeah.
place.
And there were, I mean, one of the things that gave me a lot of hope is that there were ecumenical delegates at the
Yes,
Synod and Synodality.
right.
And from what I could tell, much more involved than, say, the observers at the Second Vatican Council.
They must have been at tables also, right, interacting with it. Yeah.
Yeah. So they were at the
Now,
round tables. They weren't just watching from the sidelines. They were at part of the conversations that the Synod delegates were all having together at their shared tables.
that's right. And I have that quote. The representative of the ecumenical patriarch was there, and I have that quote from him um, that I'd like to quote. He says, um, Metropolitan Job was there representing the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, and he said he reviewed the Council of Nicaea, which is we're celebrating 1700th anniversary of Nicaea, which was a way of bringing people together. And most of their canons were about bishops, that bishops should at least involve 3 people if you're going to ordain a bishop. They should consult regularly among their synods and everything, and so forth. And then he said, he reviewed that. And then he said, in this light, we could have, and the Orthodox Church is really a church of synods. It's not just ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew. There's a Holy Synod of Constantinople. He can't act without the Holy Synod's support. Only individually on occasion, like Athenagoras and Paul VI agreed to lift the mutual excommunications, which was in 1965 as the council was closing. But that was between the patriarch and the pope. They had excommunicated each other. So, but generally, Orthodox synodality are bishops meeting and deliberating. He said, so for us, Orthodox practice is a deliberative meeting of bishops, not a consultative clergy laity assembly. In light of this, we could say that your understanding of synodality differs greatly from how we understand it. And then he added, but in history, there have been those times when lay people and clergy and bishops have deliberated and made decisions. And he gave some examples. So, in other words, even they on occasion, and if I'm not mistaken, the Patriarch of Moscow is elected by an assembly of bishops, laity, and clergy, a large assembly. So there are modes of this.
Yeah.
And Francis doesn't just want to make it bishops. He wants bishops to play a significant role in the decision, but he wants consensus and he wants lay people and clergy present. And I think that's quite an important step. And the churches of the Reformation, Church of England, the Anglican Communion, the Lutheran World Federation, Lutheran churches, Presbyterians, they all developed synodality. They in various forms, and listen to Episcopalians talking about the vestry that makes all the decisions for the local Episcopal church. They even hire the pastor. The bishop appoints him, but they actually interview and hire the pastor. So the church-wide assembly of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America is the deliberative body.
Mm-hmm.
And so somewhere between what the Orthodox are doing and the churches of the Reformation are doing, Francis wanted to find something that fit for us Catholics. And I think that's what we're working on now. And it may be we'll have a synod on synodality with the other churches. I'll give the example. As when I worked at the conference, I was handling for 8 years Anglican Catholic relations. And so I went to that assembly, churchwide assembly of the Episcopal Church in Denver, when on the agenda was the acceptance of the candidacy of a bishop for the church diocese of New Hampshire who was living in a gay partnered relationship. And it had, because this appointment was to be made within 6 months of general convention, that meant the diocese couldn't just vote it individually and send it to New Hampshire. They had to meet in assembly at the general convention. And I sat in the debate, and one side would say, we've been over this before, scripture's on our side. And the other side would say, we've been over this before, scripture is on our side. And they took an up and down vote, and you had dissatisfied people and satisfied people, but it didn't work as a consensus. That's synodality. And in fact, it led to the Episcopal Church being in impaired communion from the Anglican communion, because the center of gravity of Anglicanism has shifted to Africa, and many of the churches in Africa said, we cannot accept what the Episcopal Church is doing. We cannot accept ordaining people in these relationships. And so
yeah,
they're an impaired communion.
I am happy to say, though, that because there is not currently an Archbishop of Canterbury, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States will be the representative of the Anglican Communion at the Pope's celebration of his new ministry coming soon. So they're back in the fold. I want to go back because one of the things I think that that's really important here for not just understanding our ecumenical relations, but understanding synodality and the place of lay people in synodality, as you said, in a way that perhaps might be even moving further than the Orthodox. One term that you use, I think, is really important, is about our shared baptismal identity.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, because what we came to realize at Vatican II 60 years ago was that through baptism, everyone is made members of the one church. So all Christians are members of the one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. And so we all share a baptismal identity. And it is through our baptismal identity that we are able to participate in the life of the church. Not only that, the Synod uses this, and Pope Francis used it also, this sensus fidei, a sense of the faith, sensus fidei. It's something instinctive, intuitive, that all people have. And they say through the anointing of the Holy Spirit that we receive at baptism and developed in the life of the church, Christians develop a sense of the faith. It's related to piety, a major part of it. It's how you live according to your faith in the church, and it's instinctive. It's distinct from sensus fidelium. So there's two terms that theologians use: sensus fidei and sensus fidelium. John Henry Newman triumphed the role of sensus fidelium, which means the what the sense of the faithful is about a particular doctrine. That if the church wants to bring forth a doctrine and define something, the people have to agree to it. They just can't define it. If the people don't accept it, if the sensus fidelium is such that it can't be accepted, then it's not going to work. But that's different from sensus fidei, which each of us have. It's what gets you to church. It's what gets you to want to celebrate the liturgy with their fellow parishioners. And
Or do a
so
Zoom on a Monday night.
that's right. So all of us, sensus fide and baptismal identity, brings us together in the Christian people, and that inspiration of the Spirit is what brings us into the synodal experience of sharing our faith and deliberating.
And both Pope Francis repeatedly and the Synod on Synodality, but also most recently Pope Leo, have both pointed to this didn't start. This isn't an innovation. This isn't something that Pope Francis, have started or Pope Leo started. Tell us how this is rooted in Vatican II, because this is where Vatican II. I mean, Vatican II is not the first start either. This goes back to the ancient tradition of the Church, but
Right.
Vatican II renewed our understanding of our baptismal identity.
Absolutely. It certainly did. And we began to understand that baptism was once and for all. And if you remember back in the day before the council, when Protestants were brought into the Catholic Church, we called them converts, and we actually baptized them conditionally. And we don't do that anymore. We accept people and the testimony that they give for how they were baptized. And if we accept that, so they're already members of the one Church of Christ. So the sacrament of baptism is shared across all the churches, is respected as such, which means that all of us share in have that experience of the sensus fidei too. So
Yeah.
now Leo, in his talk to the cardinals, drew out 6 priorities from the first document of Pope Francis, Evangelii Gaudium, and he I've got those right here. I recovered those. He want to return to the primacy of Christ in proclamation. So we are preaching Christ. That's not ourselves. That's Pauline. The missionary conversion of the entire Christian community. So it is the final document. It emphasizes our communion and our responsibility. What is it? Synodal church, communion, participation, and mission for a synodal church for the mission of the church. The missionary conversion, growth in collegiality and synodality, attention to the sensus fidei, especially in its most authentic and inclusive forms, such as popular piety, loving care for the least and the rejected, priority for the poor, and courageous and trusting dialogue with the contemporary world in its various components and realities. So that would be dialogue with the world, dialogue with other Christians, dialogue with non-believers, dialogue with people of other faiths, accompaniment that we are. Thomas Stransky first defined for me in 1981, and Stransky was an American Paulist there at the ground floor at the council. He said, ecumenism is the pilgrimage of the Christian people. And that was long before Francis started talking about accompaniment as Pope. But that's one way he redefined dialogue. So now he says this is very different from populism. Francis would point out in his writings, populism is a kind of majority rule, and he wants to build it on consensus, synodality, and the ecumenical journey. So, yeah.
Yeah, and you can see that in the way that I know some Catholics I know were disappointed that the reforms that many of us have been hoping for from the Synod and Synodality didn't happen,
Right.
especially around the place of women in the church, especially upon the roles of LGBTQ Catholics. And at the
Right.
same time, the logic, even if we don't necessarily always agree with it, but the logic for Pope Francis of taking things off the table was the church needs to move so that there's no one too far in front and no one's getting left behind. That sort of mission of unity. That can
Right.
be frustrating for us who are impatient and perhaps with good holy impatience for a church with more justice for everyone who's part of the
But
church.
an illustration of this very point of the role of the laity. I bet you every bishop who's been converted to understanding the importance of recognizing the lives and faith of people of the LGBTQ community has come from having someone in their own family or being working with families, parents of children who have come to accept it, and feel that there's children are now being excluded from the church. I think it is from the faithful that these changes take place. And this probably slavery was another one that rose up from the experience of the laity in the church and its change on that. A lot of things I think arose out of the laity, out of informing the hierarchy that we can't live with this. We have to change. So.
Yeah, and which is a great, I mean, when you read Lumen Gentium, this is wonderful. We are all, if you've been to a baptism recently, if you've witnessed we're doing baptisms in the parish right now, you know this very well, that we baptize people to be priests, prophets, and kings. And we use that threefold language of Christ's three roles or offices. And we say that about our new baptized. And in Lumen Gentium, there's the first time we have in a Catholic document where they appropriate that. And they say, yes, all the Christian faithful by their baptism are part of the priesthood of Christ by their prayer, by their joining in worship and the Eucharist. And they're part of the prophetic role of Christ, the sensus fidelium, and the way in which they know the faith sometimes better than the theologians or as much as the pastors do. And then they say, oh yeah, and the royal priesthood. And now we're going to move on to the next chapter. And what synodality seems to be doing is trying to flesh out what does all of the baptized faithful's participation in the governance of our church, with distinctions in these various roles between the ordained and the non-ordained.
Well, Francis used the example. If you want to know who Mary is, you ask theologians. If you want to know how to love Mary, you ask the people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how he would distinguish this sensus fidei from the work of theologians. He was harsh on theologians, himself not really officially being a theologian since he never finished that degree, but he was quite theological in many ways. But he would prod them, saying, at one ecumenical gathering that I attended, I listened, I couldn't believe he's saying, when Christ comes again, you're going to still be arguing your pet theological theories about the unity of the church. Get on with it,
Yeah. Yeah. Let's
So
talk a bit about the future of ecumenism. So, what did you see coming out of the final document of the Synod on Synodality on ecumenism, or what do you see about the future of ecumenism that's still possible? Especially, many people talk about that we've entered an ecumenical winter, or that at least the initial hopes for ecumenism of those first generations um, realized we had a lot more work to do than we might have realized, say, in 1965. So where are we
right.
going? Where have we been, and where are we going in our ecumenical work?
I think people have talked about an ecumenical winter, but of course, many things were happening that weren't just coming on our radar. And so, through the work of the ecumenical movement, a lot of churches have reached agreements of full communion, and that's been going on for years and years, based on shared ecumenical documents. We pretty much have consensus across the board on baptism and Eucharist among all the churches in the ecumenical movement. And it's what's happened is we had a slowing down on the Catholic side during the latter years of John Paul II, and then under Benedict, and now Francis wanted to move them further and get us back moving again, and he did this in his own sort of way by leaving open questions. But in fact, you cannot decree unity. You have to let the experience of unity grow on people and let them begin asking for more and more. And so, for example, most anytime a church makes an announcement that only Catholics may receive, they're violating canon law. We ecumenists like to say that all the time. You cannot make a general invitation, nor can you make a general denial, only Catholics may receive. It's always a pastoral decision about where this particular Christian is in his or her faith, the need for the Eucharist at this time, and even the Greek Archbishop of America, I heard in a conversation saying, we know that lay people are voting with their feet. When we have communion in the Orthodox Church, we don't put up a passport check. I couldn't believe I was hearing this from an Orthodox bishop. Of course, An Orthodox parish tends to be smaller and more like a village, so everybody knows who everybody else is. But certainly not at a place like St. Patrick's Cathedral. You can kind of go in and get communion. And if any of you have been a Eucharistic minister at Easter, you know what it's like when people are saying, "Oh, thank you," and so forth. So, but the point is that, and this came out in the Synod on marriage, where he wouldn't just say something yes or no about whether divorced and remarried people should be admitted to the sacraments. It really depends on a pastoral discernment, which he was calling for. He was once asked by a Lutheran woman married to a Catholic at an address he was giving in Rome, and there was Cardinal Kasper in the front row, who headed Christian Unity and was a rather open theologian and so forth. He said, "You want me to answer this question with Cardinal Kasper here?" He said, "Well, we've made great progress, and for Lutherans and Catholics, yes, and yes, well, we have rules, and and he just kind of ended up, you make your own decision, and that's happening. And I think I do know that this has been recommended by a group of theologians that have reviewed all that has been accomplished by Lutherans and Catholics and have made recommendations that we should open up sacramental sharing. It's really easy with anointing and with reconciliation, sharing those. It comes down to the Eucharist. But I think we're going to, I'm hoping that we can open up. Now, Pope Leo doesn't have the same ecumenical experience. So we're going to see. He's been in Peru. He would know what things are like, in parishes here in the United States when he's come back to visit. But I don't know if we're going to, it really depends. We need somebody appointed to that, to head the Dicastery for Christian Unity now that Cardinal Koch has reached his 75 years. And we need somebody who can move things, because the staff has produced great stuff, but he's often sat on it and not let it come out. So I'm hopeful that it will keep going. And it's we understand in our American society we're polarized. So
And one last, sorry, go ahead.
there are many parishes where they wouldn't even think about it, and they still make the announcement only Catholics may receive, which any Orthodox can receive at a Catholic church from our point of view. So anyway.
Yeah, I've always railed against the little printed instructions as well, because the way in which it kind of normalizes things. Like, we shouldn't be saying we can't receive communion without lamenting that we can't receive communion. It should always be a moment of pain and not a moment of the normal.
Right. Well, I mean, we're talking about Eucharistic sharing, and that's different than a kind of intercommunion, because we haven't reached full communion yet with other churches, with these other churches. And so it's a little more complicated when it comes to the role of ministers at a Eucharist.
Yeah.
So then it begins to look like concelebration, which it isn't. So, we'll just have to wait and see how it's implemented. Find a way,
John,
But I do think that we'll have more consultation. We'll begin to be accountable to one another in ways that we can be. Certainly, there were great breakthroughs under Francis, and he and the Ecumenical Patriarch functioned very well together. By the way, I think the synodal structure of the Orthodox Church is on display, but has failed the Orthodox Church with the war in Ukraine. That's very obvious when you have one patriarch and others with him saying that the Ukrainians are no longer living as true Orthodox, and we've got to replace them. And there's no consensus. You've got about 5 independent churches of the Orthodox. There's 15, 16, depends on how you count them, independent churches. And you got those who meet with the Ecumenical Patriarch. They have tried for over 100 years to have a great and holy synod. And if one church stays away, there's no consensus. the way they understand it.
And the Russians pulled out the last minute that time, last 2, 3.
Yes, there are about 3 churches that stayed away
Yeah.
from the synod when they had it. So that's the problem. And we got to find, that hasn't worked. That form of synodality is not working. And the war in Ukraine and innovations are not possible. Attempts were made. So we can expect, I think we can expect some kind of breakthroughs on the churches coming together. But
yeah. John, I have one more question. One more question, and I want to give space for other questions. And you might hear my dog in the background. I'm sorry. What do you think about Pope Leo? And where we're going with Pope Leo, and then after this, I'll open up for questions from everyone else who's here. What do you think about Pope Leo, about where synodality may be going, about where ecumenism may be going, about where baptism may be going, and our recognition of our baptismal identity may be going in the coming years, based on what we know so far?
Well, he's saying all the right things at this point. And so I'm happy about that. I'm still kind of waiting to see how he begins to function, because again, he has little ecumenical and interreligious experience. He's had very good experience in Latin America. And in fact, if people saw that interview he gave at the parish in New Lenox, Illinois, an Augustinian parish, he talks about, in some parts of the world, synodality has been functioning even before Vatican II. And in particular, I'm thinking about the conference of the Episcopal conferences of Latin America and the Caribbean, CELAM, which has been meeting as an institution for a long time and producing extraordinary documents on social justice and concern for the poor and so forth. The most recent one was in Brazil in 2007, Aparecida. And in fact, the one who chaired the writing of that final document was Bergoglio, was Pope Francis. And so Leo is dedicated to that. He knows about prayer groups. He knows about base communities. All of those were developed in Latin America as a form of synodality. And in parishes and in dioceses, there are regular synods taking place in preparations for the regional synods. But it's not happening. And then he contrasts it. We all know about, most Catholics don't see the bishop, maybe for confirmation, but sometimes it's the auxiliary bishop. There's very little contact between the hierarchy and the people. And so he was saying, we failed in the United States. We have failed at synodality. Now, we had a pope that wanted to, remove Episcopal conferences and to say that they have nothing but an advisory position. And over the time I was at the bishops' conference, it went from the time that it was writing pastoral letters that moved the American people to a time that it could no longer do that. I can remember the one that failed, the pastoral letter on women, failed, about concerns that if we are too positive here, women are going to want to be ordained. I mean, so I really think that that question of the ordination of women, which I don't think Francis himself was ready to address, is on the table. But I'm not sure if from Latin America this experience is going to help. Certainly, the need for more clergy is known, and he'll know about that. So, so that's Gore. And he talks about accompaniment. He talks about dialogue. He talks about encounter. So he's certainly using the language of Francis. And he and Francis were in touch with each other over the years. And that parish interview points all of that out. So I'm waiting to see how, in fact, he's going to live as a pope. What are he going to be? Is he going to have a body of cardinals advising him? How will he handle the synodal practice? Will he keep this going as Francis started? I think it's kind of a wait and see on this one. I'm certainly relieved that it wasn't somebody who wanted to dismantle what Francis had accomplished.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think synodality will be what people remember Pope Francis about, what he did for that, in spite of all the other things that I think he he did. And I should write an article sometime based on my experience of knowing Rabbi Skorka, who lives just down the street from the parish now. But Pope Francis had among his best friends Rabbi Abraham Skorka. And in fact, the evening he was elected Pope, and if you remember, it was a dark sky in Rome when he went out to greet the crowd. That evening, he called Abe, in Argentina to say, "Oh, I'm not coming home. They're keeping me here, so we can't have our appointment next week." And all of this. So they would talk from time to time. Would that every bishop had among his best friends a rabbi. What
Mm-hmm.
that would do for the church, that you at least were sensitive to how Jews would be reading the gospel or reading this passage from the Jewish scriptures. It's significant on anti-Semitism and the like, and that's significant. Does will Pope Leo develop these ecumenical and interreligious friendships? I don't know. Um, these are kinds of things that I'm waiting to see.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm grateful that it's not somebody who's trying to undo. This man is quite dedicated to Francis.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Hold on one second. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove our spotlights and come back here as our larger group. And this is your chance now, if you'd like to ask John a question, to explain something more of what he said, to respond with a comment, or your own thoughts on this. So you can raise your hand if I can see you on the screen. If you have your hand, if you have your camera off, you can hit the react button down at the bottom and raise your hand that way. Or you can put something in the chat. So I see Walt and then Arlene. So Walt, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, John. That was a nice summary of a complicated concern. Two questions. One is the notion of unity within diversity. Is that kind of a white flag, best we can do, or is it more of moving toward a recognition of, at this point in history, the charisms of different groups? Second question is on ethics. It's kind of, okay, now we're starting to line up baptism and Eucharist in this, but now we're divided on ethics. And so or is there a rapprochement kind of on ethics around social justice, ecology, but then some others maybe not so? So just kind of where do you see those two items?
So the my answer to the first one is somewhat of a key to answering the second one. So the great breakthrough in ecumenical agreements in the first phase of ecumenism after the council was the Lutheran Catholic agreement on the doctrine of justification, where they could agree on a formula, but they agreed to disagree on certain interpretations. Yet they believed that this differentiated consensus allowed them to sufficiently agree to accept one another as accepting the doctrine of justification. So a differentiated consensus. And because Catholics and Lutherans had different concerns and so forth. But this was a great breakthrough so that we don't have to have absolute agreement on the meaning of every term, but we have enough agreement to say that how we understand this differently is not church dividing. And I think this same principle of differentiated consensus will then help us in ethical questions. In right now, I'd say we see how the issue of the role of LGBTQ people in the Christian church are dividing some of the churches. The United Church Methodist Church, is undergoing quite a disagreement on this, and so it's not all entirely progress. That church unions were formed. United Methodist Church represented an important phase, but it's coming apart over this issue. The same thing that affected Anglicans. I think we can reach a differentiated consensus on these issues too. It's hard work. It takes listening. It takes working theologically and so forth. So we often said that it wasn't particular ethical issues that were dividing it, but how churches reached a position on those issues. In other words, it was a question of authority and the exercise of authority. Well, now Francis has introduced a new form of synodality that is serving a role of authority in the church. And so that may be a breakthrough as far as treating some of these ethical issues. I believe so. Now, the Anglican Communion, the World Methodist Council, and the Reformed churches, Union of Reformed churches, all accepted the agreement on justification. And so they were kind of working on the next phase. I don't know where those talks are. That's got to be very complicated, how these various communions can move forward and work on something. But I think that's an answer, that we've accepted the fact of a differentiated consensus. That may be a way that we can work it out. And I think also going on in the Synod on synodality. So
Yeah, and Pope Francis used the phrase multiple times of the need for what he called a healthy decentralization,
yes.
and a way in which the same idea of letting the way that the church is church in different places diverge within a wider framework of unity, and realizing, I mean, we see this on the ground right now, that again, to stick with the issue of LGBTQ folks, or even to think about the participation of women and lay people in leadership in the church, how different that is from one part of the Catholic Church to another. And synodality and is a way, in some ways, of letting those differences, letting experimentation happen, but also letting people be church the way they want to be church in their distinctive environments.
Mm-hmm.
Arlene, I saw your hand first, and then I'll get to Don after that. So Arlene, go ahead, unmute, and share with us what you were going to say.
I was fortunate enough to come to know John when he moved to our parish, and he came at a time when there was a bit of problems with our bishop, or cardinal, whoever and I thought it was just abominable. But at any rate, I thought, why do we need the permission of the diocesan office if we want to invite a clergy person from another community in our region to come and participate in liturgy or homilies or what have you? I get the point. I mean, it was very hard, John. Your depth is I can cope with. And when we tried to establish an ecumenical group here, we lost people who were already ahead of that, and they were looking for the Muslims and everything. And it wasn't until 9/11 when suddenly everybody was looking to be everything in all places. And I'm just frustrated that we don't model inviting other clergy, other committed clergy, Christian, to participate in our liturgies. And I realize they don't have whatever you say, the celebration. What is it? They don't.
Right.
John, can you explain what that is?
Well, celebration is when ministers jointly preside at a Eucharist. So you have that between Episcopalians and Lutherans, or you have a Lutheran serving a ministerial role in an Episcopal church with their agreement of full communion. We don't have that. But there were several things going on when we had the problem with Cardinal Hickey, and he was looking for a way to get at us anyway. And part of it is now we're having more and more lay preaching, right? But even back then, that was still controversial. And so inviting, first of all, I said to the parish, we should be doing more than just, the week of prayer, let's invite the local Lutheran Episcopalian minister, preferably a woman, come and give the homily. All right, let's do that. But we should be doing something more often during the whole year. But anyway, let's do that. But then then unfortunately, then came time for the communion. They gave the vessels to the Episcopal priest to say, "Here, be a communion minister," and that was more than a role that the person should have played. I wouldn't have done that in an Episcopal church. I wouldn't have. I would say, no, I'm not a Episcopalian, unless, of course, we're out in the sticks and there are only 3 or 5 people there, or I was the only one who could stand, or something like that. Of course, but I mean, in other words, serving a role that doesn't fit the relationship. So that's what was complicated back then. So it is true that bishops can determine policy for ecumenical practice in the diocese. That needs to be revisited. Back when
where and how you see so little of the opportunity for lay people to engage in meaningful conversation with the diocesan office. I just have all respect for the bishop's role. So,
yeah,
I'd go somewhere else.
we should have more and more of that, and it involves how a bishop encourages this kind of authority and sharing. And quite frankly, many of them do not take the role of ecumenism very seriously. So I think we're in a better place now.
Really,
okay.
Because our Georgetown community shared certain things, and that's kind of fallen by the wayside. And when we got that going, it was a very meaningful experience to do that with several communities for Pentecost and for other things. Also, in terms of what's happening with migrants, we could be doing so much more to support one another.
I think so.
And I think it is it is important, I think, to recognize too that the ecumenical principle is what we can do together, we shouldn't do alone. So there's more to be done. I also think that we shouldn't discount the fact of how much, especially in not necessarily as much in worship anymore, which is there's also complicated things about how much do other Christians want to do that with us or with each other. But all of the forms of social work we do together, all of the forms of shared charity we do together, all the forms of communication, it's still very different than it would have been 100 years ago, where having these conversations or doing this collaboration would have been grounds for a dismissal in many places. I want to make sure we have time for Don. Don, go ahead and unmute and share your question.
I want to know. Yeah. One last thing. Why can't we have Joan Chittister or oh God, one of our favorites, I'm blanking, out of Albuquerque. Why can't those people come and speak at our parish?
Well, ask Brian.
I don't know of anyone who can't speak for a parish, but let's maybe a conversation for later on, Arlene. Let's go to Don.
Yeah, I actually kind of 3 questions. One, isn't there a working group on the question of ecumenism as one of the 10 working groups out of the Synod and where do you see that going? 2, do you think that the invitation to have Easter on the same Sunday, do you see that there's might be some traction for that? And then 3, do you see the possibility of continuing kind of the practice of coming together in Assisi as a place for ecumenical or interfaith gathering on behalf of peace?
That's 3 great questions. I don't know what the working group on ecumenism for the Synod is doing, and I just haven't gotten around to asking people. Maybe Catherine knows. I think she's on that, isn't she? I'm not sure. So I'd like to find that out, and it's a good thing. There's lots that they can look into, and I would really like to hear what their report is. The common date of Easter, I think a proposal has been made that we calculate Easter when Easter would fall in Jerusalem. I think this would be the calculation. But the problem is the calendar. which calendar we're going to use,
Mhm.
because the Orthodox churches are still using the Julian calendar, and we're using the Gregorian calendar. So we did celebrate Easter at the same time, but when we reformed the calendar, Gregory, what, the 16th or 14th, forgot, or 12th, was it?
Yeah.
Reformed the calendar, then we were off. So only on occasion does it fall on the same day. You raise an interesting question, because the Council of Nicaea decided that the Easter would be calculated based on the Roman calendar. What we don't think about is that there were a good many churches at that time in the Middle East, in Asia Minor, Turkey, Syria, Palestine, still using the Jewish calendar.
Yeah.
Communities that still had a Jewish Christian character to them. And some of these were churches related to John. And in fact, in Ephesus, John actually, there was testimony that John actually put on the garb of the Jewish high priest on Easter when he would celebrate, when they would celebrate Easter. Not all the churches celebrated Easter initially. And we have, it's these churches in Asia Minor that first instituted a Easter celebration, and they calculated it on the Jewish calendar, which is John's gospel. The lambs are being slaughtered as Jesus is dying on the cross, which means the Last Supper is not a Passover meal, but is the night before the Passover. That's John's gospel. And so the letter to the Church of Egypt from Nicaea, we solved the Easter problem. We're going to use the Roman calendar. Well, this was a Constantinian imperial move to reject the churches of Asia Minor. And this was really the end of the parting of the ways between Jews and Christians. So it had lasted for 2 centuries, 2.5 centuries through the Middle East. But the fact that different Christian communities would come up in Rome, so you'd have some from the Middle East with their own church, but they're celebrating Easter earlier or later than the Roman churches. And the Pope was ready to move on this. And the Bishop of Constantinople pleaded, don't do this, because this is our heritage. This goes back to John. This is how we did it. It's very fascinating. So even in the calculation of Easter, we see, even in a council, we see it not only as a cause of unity, it's a cause of disunity too. Several of the councils actually caused more disunity than they did unity. So, and then lastly, I hope he will keep the Assisi gatherings. The community of Sant'Egidio have retained this practice every year to hold an interfaith Assisi style meeting someplace in the world. And then on occasion, John Paul II did it on 3 occasions, had these Assisi days. It has happened. So certainly interfaith gatherings for prayer are happening and will continue to happen. What role the Pope will play, I don't know. By the way, this leads me to a Rabbi Skorka story, because he told me that when Archbishop Bergoglio came to his synagogue for a service, he and his wife Sylvia drove him home to his apartment. And in the car, he kept saying, we prayed together. We really prayed together. He just couldn't get over the fact it was his first real experience of praying, not in the presence of Jews, but with Jews. And it's a powerful experience that had a great impact on him. So, yeah. So anyway, I think it's hopeful, and wait and see with Leo where we're going to go. I don't want to say it could have been worse, but I just said it. It's a lot better than expected, and the fact that his consensus was quick. I had heard, in fact, Kevin Gillespie was saying it last week when he came to the program on campus where we had to reflect on Francis and his legacy. He said that an axis was forming between the bishops of Asia and the bishops of Latin America. So if you read Catholicism by John McGreevy, that thick book from the provost at Notre Dame, he'll make the point time and again that change comes from the missions. And this might be an instance of that in the Catholic Church, a true missionary bishop, and that the Archbishop of Tokyo, a cardinal, who was president of the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences, was forming a bloc with the Ceylon bishops. Now, that was only about 40 cardinals, but you get the two from Mexico and some from North America and a few others. You have a solid group, and perhaps he had that showing ballot, and that's what it was, fast momentum. When we had 4 ballots and a choice, I was convinced it was an Italian. How could it be not be so fast, not be an Italian? But I was wrong. Of course, somebody who speaks Italian rather well and was been living in Rome for a couple of years and had lived in Rome when he was superior general of the Augustinians. So he's the first Augustinian pope. Luther was an Augustinian, and maybe that's why it took this long for an Augustinian to be elected pope. And they go back to the time of the Franciscans and Dominicans. It's not like the Jesuits who are more recent. So,
of course, we will never know exactly what happened inside the conclave because they're under the secret of excommunication. So I guess unless somebody leaks at the threat of their own soul, otherwise we'll never know exactly what happened last week.
How is it then we know what happened in previous conclaves?
This is a great mystery. It's kind of, yes.
That Bergoglio was the runner-up to Ratzinger.
Our time is coming to a close. I have a couple of quick announcements, and then we get to thank our speaker. Quick announcements, as many of you know who are on my list, we have another program on baptism coming up next weekend. So we are having on Sunday morning in person at 10:15, and then at the same time next week on Monday at 7 p.m. on Zoom, we'll be talking with Tony Varis about the sacrament of baptism and how does the liturgy of baptism reflect our inform our theology of baptism. Keep your eyes out. I'm back in the office tomorrow and hoping to throw together a conversation about Pope Leo where we might have some more information, probably on Zoom, because with Memorial Day coming and summer coming, it's going to get harder and harder to do things in person at the parish. And the last announcement is something some of you are involved in our weekly book discussion group. But even if you're not, we're reading right now a book about the history of the Jesuits in the United States by David Collins, Father David Collins, who's in the history department at Georgetown University. He's going to be joining us on Thursday, May 29th. It's the last time that we're having that session. So we'll be talking to the author. Even if you didn't read the book or read it with our group, there'll be an invitation on our main page for you to join us for that. Also, in the parish on Wednesday evening, they'll be having a mass at 6:30 in the evening in the church. So notice it's in the church and not the chapel, and at 6:30 and not 5:30. But they'll be having a mass of thanksgiving for the election of Pope Leo on Wednesday evening at 6:30 p.m. And my last wonderful thing is to thank you all for attending, but to thank John for sharing his knowledge, his wisdom, his experience, and helping us put a lot of this together. So thank you, John.
Thank you, and thank all of you for coming in. Yeah.
And
so we'll just hope that Pope Leo, I think Pope Leo's I'm hopeful that we're going to keep going in the direction that Francis has taken us.
From your mouth to God's ears.
Yeah.
Have a good night, everyone, and we'll see you at the parish sometime soon. Be well.
All right. Bye-bye.